Episode 97, The Canaanites Worship. Welcome to the history of the Bible. In the last episode, we discussed the Baal cycle and how the god Baal came into power within the Canaanite religion. His power dictated how the Canaanites worship their deities. However, just because Baal was the ruler over all the other deities, that doesn't mean the other gods and goddesses didn't have dedicated worshippers. In this episode, we will examine how the people worshipped each god and goddess. Often, the Canaanites solely focused on their most pressing needs, such as food and water. When a group of people came to a new land, they settled and built where the soil was most fertile. Often, this meant their needs for food and water were covered. When people came into the land to settle, it was believed the soil was fertilized by one of the divine beings. However, the land fertilized could be owned by a god, goddess, or demon. In the beginning of the Canaanite religion, whoever the owner of the land was called Baal. The word Baal can mean either possesses, owner, or lord. It wasn't until the culture of the Canaanites developed that the formal worship of Baal was organized. What's different from the Canaanite religion and that of the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians is the land of Canaan relied on rain for water. The Egyptians and the Mesopotamians used irrigation for their land, so they mostly worshiped gods concerning the Euphrates River and the Nile River. This is how Baal would, as he was the god of the sky, became associated with the fertility of the land through rain. However, fertility would not just be associated with the land. It would expand into all fertility of the land, animals, and people. Because when a land had enough food and water to provide for a growing population and larger herds, the population growth is tightly correlated to the land being fruitful. Thus, the worship of Baal would begin to be acts done through sexual indulgences. As time passed, settlements became cities, and the Canaanites built places of worship, such as temples and sanctuaries. Baal became a more formalized god in the land and was eventually associated with Ashtoreth as his partner. However, in myths and archaeology, Ashtoreth was Baal's partner most of the time. Ashtoreth would go by many different names, Ashtoreth and Astarte being a few. In some parts of her worship, she is sometimes portrayed as a goddess of war and hunting. However, as her worship became more formalized, she would take on the attributes of being the goddess of love, sexuality, sensuality, fertility, and war. The worship of Baal and Ashtoreth was closely related. However, depending on the location, some cities focused more on worshiping Ashtoreth, while in other areas, the worship was geared towards Baal. This is evident in the different types of temples built and the gods and goddesses they were dedicated to. The main gods and goddesses had temples built for them throughout Canaan. In these temples were the acts of worship done through animal sacrifices, harvest sacrifices, and feasting. However, because both Baal and Ashtoreth were deities of fertility, the people's acts of worship also included male and female cult prostitution. Cult prostitution was often done by the priest or priestess who served in the temples. But it wasn't just going to the temple to do sexual acts as worship. The people of Canaan committed sexual acts with other family members to do acts of worship. In Leviticus, God tells Moses to command the Israelites to not commit the acts done by the people in the land of Canaan. Some of the acts committed by the Canaanites were people having sex with their mother or stepmother, their sister, sister-in-law, or stepsister, nieces, aunts, daughter-in-law, with a woman and her daughter, other men, and animals. Yes, bestiality was a thing. Many gods and goddesses are depicted as having parts of animal appearances. Therefore, when someone would approach an animal to have sex with it, it was often done out of worship for their deity. Cult prostitution was often done in the temples of Ashtoreth, as she was the goddess of love, sexuality, and fertility. Some practices show that the high priestess of Ashtoreth would have sex with the high priest of Baal to release the blessing of fertility on the land, people, and animals. As for the other priestess within the Ashtoreth temple, they would have sex with temple visitors to continue blessing the land and its people. There are some beliefs that every woman at some point in her life had to attend the temple and agree to have sex with a visitor to the temple. This act was done for the women of the community to gain the blessing of fertility from their beloved goddess. The people of Canaan also worshiped their deities through sacrifices. Yes, they made the normal animal sacrifices meant to bring more favor upon themselves and the land. However, the Canaanites made another type of sacrifice. On numerous accounts throughout the time the Israelites were going from Egypt to the Promised Land, the Lord told them not to follow the practices of the Canaanites. Some of these warnings can be found in Leviticus chapters 18 and 20. However, through Leviticus and parts of Deuteronomy, the Lord gives warning of what not to do, because these were the practices the Canaanites did to worship their deities. In Leviticus 18 and 20, the Lord tells the Israelites to not follow the worship of Moloch. For many years, scholars believe Moloch to be another deity within the polytheism, the worship of multiple gods and goddesses, society the Canaanites had. However, it wasn't until about 100 years ago the idea began to change. The English word we use for Moloch is believed to have originated from the Phoenician word Molch, which was thought to have been some type of god. However, it's come to be believed that the word Molch is connected to the word Moloch, which is the Hebrew word meaning king. Moloch was just a reference to the king of the gods, which would have been Baal. This is when the idea that Moloch was not just a god, but a means of sacrifice emerged. Scholars still debate whether Moloch is a god or a type of sacrifice given to a deity. Looking at both points of view, the thought of Moloch being a type of sacrifice, this would mean the Lord was telling the Israelites to not participate in offering their children to either himself or other deities. Some scholars believe the word Moloch is a combination of Hebrew words, Malik, Molch, and Bosheth. Stating the word Molch was a type of sacrifice. The word Malik means king, and the word Bosheth means shame. When combined, the word that is believed to come forth is Moloch, which means ruler of shameful sacrifices. The thought was it was a sacrifice of offering one's children to the king of the gods, Baal. Now, on the other hand, many scholars believe it is an actual god the Canaanites, or one of the surrounding nations, that they sacrificed their children to. And we'll talk more about what the sacrifice looked like in a moment. However, the name Moloch is only found in the Bible. There are other deities mentioned in historical records that are similar to the name Moloch, but nothing that quite fits. Most of the other gods who are believed to be a different name of Moloch are connected to the underworld. The only issue with these other gods is none of them are recorded as ever accepting children as sacrifices. Now, it is thought that the children's sacrifices that were made in Carthage a city in North Africa in ancient times, was connected to the Canaanites. The city of Carthage was once a colony of the Phoenicians, or the Canaanites. The Greeks called those who lived in the land of Canaan Phoenicians, as they were the people who created the purple dye. Phoenicia in Greek simply means purple. Therefore, the Phoenicians and the Canaanites are the same people groups, just different names. As mentioned, the city of Carthage started out as a simple colony of the Canaanites. The colony would grow until it became one of the most prosperous city-states in the ancient world, one that would eventually compete against the Romans in the Punic Wars, which ended in 146 BC. However, that is many years in the future. For the time when the colony was settled, the people brought many of their gods and cultic practices with them. One of these practices was the sacrificing of children in worship. It is believed the city worshipped an earlier form of the Roman god Saturn. Saturn is the Roman god, which is the same god the Greeks had, just under a different name. The Greeks called this god Kronos, who was the first generation of Titans. To give a little bit of Greek mythology, Kronos would overthrow his father and come in to rule over the earth. In the mythology, this was a golden era for the humans where the land was prosperous. However, the good times would not last. Kronos is believed to have grown paranoid of losing his power, especially when a prophecy said that his children would overthrow him. So to not allow for his children to overthrow him, Kronos would swallow his children when his wife gave birth to them. However, eventually his wife was tired of him eating their children, so she tricked Kronos into swallowing a rock instead of their youngest child, Zeus. Mythology would go on to say, with assistance, Zeus would eventually overthrow his father and set his siblings free from the belly of Kronos. The people of Carthage called their version of the gods Saturn and Kronos Baal Haman. Baal again simply means Lord. This means the Carthage god Baal Haman is believed to be the king over all the other gods. The same as the Canaanites' god, named just Baal, is the king over all of the other deities. Baal Haman was the god of the weather and the fertility of land. This is the same thing Baal, the Canaanites' deity, was lord over. It is believed to be the same god, just with a different name. So how did the Carthaginians worship their god, Baal Haman? Answering this question may give us insight into how the Canaanites worshiped their gods. Because Saturn, or Kronos, was known in mythology to swallow up his children, it is believed the people of Carthage worship him by imitating it. What this means is the people of Carthage would offer their children to be swallowed up by Saturn, or as the Carthaginians called him, Baal Haman. For the Carthaginians, their god Baal Haman had a consort, or a partner, named Tanit. Tanit also had the name Ashtoreth, who also had the name Astarte for the Canaanites. There is an open-air temple dedicated to the goddess Tanit in Carthage. It is here where numerous urns have been found of human remains, mostly of infants and babies. The people would offer children as sacrifices to the divine couple, Baal Haman and Tanit, who are the same gods the Canaanites had, Baal and Ashtoreth. Many ancient Greek and Roman historians have been found to mention the Carthaginians as well as the Phoenicians, who are the Canaanites, would vow one of their children, burning it as a sacrifice to the deity to obtain great favor. However, there are critics of the belief that the city of Carthage offered children as sacrifices. Rather than saying it was a sacrifice, some scholars say it was a place where grieving parents would bring their children who died prematurely and had them cremated before their divine couple. But more and more evidence has been found to point towards the children being used as sacrifices to gain favor or to regain the favor of the god and goddess. It has been reported that 20,000 burials of infant bones, along with animal bones, have been discovered in Carthage. The reason we are talking about the Carthaginians is because they originally came from the land of Canaan. Therefore, many of the cultic practices the Carthaginians did came from the land of Canaan. Depictions of the two deities have been found in the land of Canaan hundreds of years before the colony of Carthage was ever found. As more evidence comes out of the city of Carthage, there have been discovery of those same images depicting the two deities to come from Carthage. The people of Carthage share the same heritage when it comes to their gods as the Canaanites do. That is why we are looking at the Carthaginians and their cultic practices. Going back to the question asked earlier, was Moloch a god of the Canaanites, or was it just a type of sacrifice? It cannot be known for sure. However, more evidence points towards it being a type of sacrifice that was offered to Baal or some form of him throughout the land of Canaan. Even the way the sacrifice was made is debated. Yes, it was a sacrifice of children, but some records talk about the passing through the fire of Moloch, and others talk about the actual offering of the child as a sacrifice. Although there is evidence of the ash remains of children. The first thought of the sacrifice has been referred to as passing through the fire. This is where children were made to walk between two lines of fire. This type of sacrifice is believed to just be a divinatory or protective rite. This rite would not harm the child, as they only passed through the center of two parallel lines of fire. Jewish scholars believe this type of rite to be similar to that of a marriage contract. The parents would have their children walk through the fire of Moloch to show they are now married to the Canaanite religion. The child was now part of or controlled by the god's wishes. It is believed that some ways of doing the offering were done in that if a parent wanted to recant their child's agreement with the Canaanite religion, it would violate the contract and the child was to be burned. However, not all records indicate the parents having to sacrifice their children if the contract was broken. It was more of a child's dedication to the Canaanite religion. The whole point of this type of offering was to be a human sacrifice, not causing the death of the person, but that they were to live their life out in this contract with the Canaanite god. Think of it as baptism for Christianity or First Holy Communion with the Catholic Church. The other way it is believed a child was sacrificed was burned in the fire to Moloch. A statue of the god of Baal, or one of the names of the Canaanite god, would be made up of bronze, with its hands extended and its palms facing upward. The hands of the statue would be at an angle to the ground in the position of offering an object from one person to another. The reason for the hands being done this way was thought so that the child could be set on the upward facing palms and would not roll out of the hands. Now, it is thought that a fire was set underneath the upward facing palms to burn the child. Another thought is is that a fire was built at the base or within the chest of the statue. Because it was made of bronze, the statue would heat up to high temperatures. So when the child was placed in the statue's hands, the palms themselves would burn the child. The other way that the statue of the god has been discovered is with cavities or holes inside of the torso. The child would then be placed inside one of the cavities in the torso of the statue and would be burned up. Of course, this would cause screaming from the children as they were being burned alive. This is where it has been documented by ancient scholars that the priests would gather around the area of the statue and play loudly flutes and drums to drown out the cries of the child. However, there is a debate between scholars on whether or not the child was alive when burned. Some reports suggest the child was killed first before being placed on the palms of the statue or within. It is believed the sacrifice of children were all classes, although it has been seen that noble families would raise or nurture lower class children and then offer them instead of their own child. Other reports show parents offering the children with disabilities to trade them in hopes of later receiving a healthy one in the defective child's place. Other scholars believe it was the children who were sacrificed that came from the sacred prostitution, who were impregnated while serving in the temple as a priest or priestess. To go back to whether or not it was a god or a type of sacrifice, the answer isn't known. It could be both, it could be one or the other. Either way, children were sacrificed. Some evidence shows it was just parents dedicating to a false god by having them walk through 2 lines of fire. And other evidence shows it was children being burned alive by being placed on or within the statue. And it was all classes of children, from the poor to the noble using the poor's children, and it was the child of occultic prostitution. Often, the worship of the Canaanites' gods and goddesses was done in temples. However, shrines were built for the deities throughout the land of Canaan, in homes, in cities, in the fields, in the valleys, and on the hilltops. This should give some background on the Canaanites and how they worshiped their deities. And this is what the Israelites were coming into when Joshua led them into the Promised Land. So join us next time in episode 98. Until next time, remember that you are loved, special, and worthwhile.